the audience that would like to participate or watch, WashingtonCity.org/meetings, entertain a motion to approve the agenda. Well, our agenda is the councilman.
Mayor, I'll make that motion.
Thank you.
And Ward will second. Right. Coates will second, then Ward will.
All right. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.
I'm probably in favor.
Okay, Lester.
I like to take my mics on.
Mayor, council, it's good to see you guys again. This is kind of the special meeting that you guys wanted to have, just to go through and discuss a little more in depth some of the implications of the low impact development requirements that have been set forth for us by the state. And hopefully I'm able to answer your questions this afternoon. Not sure specifically what you would like to go more in depth about, whether it be process or specifics associated with it. I'll be happy to explain anything I can.
Yeah, Councilman Coates, you were kind of jumping in on a few of those. Why don't you teach me where we're at now? And
So where we're at,
maybe we can,
as in what our current requirement is with the MS4.
That's kind of where I guess, and that's what was interesting about what you were saying previously, was I recognized that I really didn't know a lot of things there. So I think if we could go there and then maybe just transition into your understanding of what's new, and then he can correct you everything you say that's wrong.
I hope he corrects me that I'm wrong. And me and Lester.
You did that last night, right? With the trash removal stuff. That worked out well.
And I have an update on that later. I'll tell you.
Oh, cool.
So, but I don't want to interrupt this session on that. But yeah, will do. So currently, where my understanding is our current MS4, which is pretty in depth. It's been going on a while, and I'm going to strictly go to the LID and stormwater detention. So typically, they require you to detain your water on your project site. And with the new MS4 that came out, what year was it, Lester? In like 3 years ago?
Yeah, 3 years ago, we were issued a permit that contemplated some of this LID stuff, and it's been delayed up until February of this last year when they finally finalized it. So they had granted numerous extensions on the LID.
And that was the big thing, is there was a lot of issues going down saying, hey, how can you enforce this? And they want more clarification, more detail. And my concern is that typically, I hope you all understand, and maybe you don't, so I'll try to make it simple on detention. When you develop a site, when you make more impervious areas, streets, rooftops, the water runs faster off the site. So the detention is supposed to hold it back during the storm event and then release it out slowly. Does that make sense to everyone? Why we have our detention basins? And the key is you don't want to send your water downstream faster and flood your neighbor. So that's real simple. That's to hold back the water during the large storm event and then discharge it at a slower rate later on.
And how that's applied, I mean, I guess I understand it in theory, but as we start getting into this, maybe I'll just ask some dumb questions and risk embarrassing myself. But so if it was literally just a single home, which we almost never get, just a single home built anymore, what would that requirement look like for?
Well, it all depends on your site. If you're a single home on 20 acres, it's a lot different than a single home on 1,200 square feet.
Okay.
It's totally different. And most developments are developed based on the subdivision. So whatever kind of subdivision it is, you have to take the areas that are going to be homes.
And that I kind of understand, because I see that come through a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we constantly see subdivision level, and they're able to just kind of direct it all to one location on there, and then they're delay it. Tell me, so then just give me like a runoff. We'll just stay at the subdivision level, because we hardly ever see single homes anymore. But how much time do they have to delay it for? What are the metrics that they're gauged on?
There's so much into it. I can't just tell you that because soil matters.
Okay.
We get into the classifications where we have A, B, C, and D soils. So a D soil typically will run off faster than an A soil that will percolate into the ground better. An A soil is a sand. A sand will percolate water in. A D soil can be a rock. So it's solid rock. So it's kind of like an impervious surface too. It's hard, it runs off faster. So that's how they classify that. And then you put it into a formula to determine. So basically in a drainage report, you've got your pre-existing conditions of how they are today. And then you have your post conditions, which is after the streets, homes, everything's improved. And then there's a lot of equations. I'm making it real simple.
No, that's fine.
And
I
you're
understand.
basically
I
what you
understand I'm not
do
gonna
is
get a degree here.
you basically take you got your peaks and you make it so the peak is never higher. So you're not discharging you're not discharging more water off your site during that event
Then it would have,
if it was in the precondition.
okay. And then that is really the standard, is the precondition.
That is the
So
standard.
there isn't like a zero tolerance for once you develop it, you can't run off anything. You're dealing with it as if it was
Natural land,
natural land.
a desert, and
And
those
then-
all have different classifications too.
So
So like different areas. Like if we lived somewhere else that wasn't so desert, you would
yeah.
have a different formula, a different rain pattern, different everything. We work off the NOAA Atlas 14.
But in I'm trying to mix some of my education with this, which has kind of been experience level education. So when we talk about some of the developments north of us and having problems on Washington, or excuse me, on Main Street here in Washington, several times we're saying, well, we're in better shape now because it's developed, because they're required to actually put in retention, but we're really basically, the detention that they're putting in is really basically to put it back to original level.
But just so you know, there's an air factor that you air for.
Okay.
You're not going to push that limit. Why would you take that risk?
Well, but they're really only required to put it in at the level that it's engineered for. So beyond, though, because catastrophic.
But it does help
events
slow it
beyond-
down. It helps sediment. It helps. There's a lot more involved than just that's a real simplistic way of looking at that. I'm just saying that the requirement is, you can't discharge more than you historically have.
Okay, so but then help me understand how that ties in with regional basins, right? So you have, is it the same level, or do those regional basins?
It's the same level. All you're doing is conveying it downstream to the detention basin. It's just a bigger scale.
But Councilman, you need to factor into the goal for this entire program is just to reduce the amount of pollutants that get back into the river and the
So
ocean.
we're not actually into that yet, right? I mean, just topically, we're still kind of talking about the old law and with the old rules. I'm just trying. Maybe you're right. I just want to make sure I'm clear, because right now
But
we haven't talked about any pollutants. It's just
No, but
mostly
that's what
runoff and
the
sediment.
MS4 is. The MS4 is a pollutant discharge to the
new-
rivers.
The new rule, because I'm
All
having
of
trouble
them.
with
All
my-
MS4 is that.
Yeah, they're
I'm just
in here.
explaining drainage.
What does MS4 stand for?
It's, what is it, Lester?
Municipal separate storm sewer system.
Oh, that's cute.
It's S, what is it? Square.
Okay. And
S-
then the new regulation, Lester referred to that. This is the, what is it?
So it's not it's still the MS4.
Right.
They're just adding to it.
Is-
So they had, I'm going to call it phase 1. And they're like, oh, by the way, we want to add some more stuff to it. Am I wrong, Lester?
No, that's exactly what it is. They're incrementally bringing in the requirements of the Clean Water Act that the EPA instigated. Back, everyone's seen the pictures when the rivers were catching on fire back east from all the pollutants in it. That's when all of this stuff started, when they put the Clean Water Act in place. All the requirements of the Clean Water Act were not implemented at the same time. And this is ongoing implementation of the Clean Water Act.
But Lester, this is part of a philosophy change too, because I know that the previous strategy had to do with collecting and disposing of stormwater quickly using engineered type systems, and the current strategy has to do with four parts: avoid and reduce impact,
Right.
development, and manage stormwater at its source through the LID, and then emulate functions of natural systems to reintegrate rainfall into the water cycle rather than disposing of it as a waste product. So it's get water back where it needs to be.
Right. A lot of the concept behind these low impact development processes is to keep that treatment process at the most minuscule local level. So that's what they're trying to do, is make sure that that water is infiltrating as much as possible in that same watershed area where it was generated, instead of sending it downstream to accomplish that same function.
Lester, would you share with us what you understand about the federal level of this and kind of how it came about and its history and how it's gone through the legislature or legislation?
Like I said, this started back with the Clean Water Act, when the requirements were originally made, and we've, in 2005, I believe it was, the state got mandated by the EPA to start implementing these practices to clean up the stormwater discharges into all waters of the state, which in turn all flow to waters of the US. So it starts at the federal level, and then it moved to the state level, from the feds making requirements of the state. The state in turn came out with what was referred to as phase 1 of the MS4 requirements, which only included Salt Lake City and Salt Lake County. It was all population based. They started implementing requirements by way of a state stormwater discharge permit. So the state began issuing permits to all the municipalities that were in phase 1, which, just because of our population in Utah, that only equated to Salt Lake City, Salt Lake County.
And that was in 2018 or something.
No, that happened back in about 2005. Then in 2007, they implemented what is referred to as the phase 2 regulations. Washington City is one of the phase 2 municipalities because of our proximity to St. George. It's all based upon population. So because of St. George's size, we got drug into it as being one of the phase 2 cities. Our first permit was issued to us in 2007 with a huge pile of requirements. That is when our stormwater program began, and when we generated our grading manual, our grading permit process, all of that stuff came into play for making sure that we're implementing the best management practices to do what we can to keep sediment, fertilizers, garbage, any other debris from reaching the waters of the state. That permit was in place for, I believe it was 4 years. They issued another permit. At that point is when all of the requirements came into play for all of the post-construction management agreements, post-construction management plans, all of that stuff, which is something that we're getting with every subdivision now. Basically requiring the maintenance of the facilities, which most of them facilities were kind of a joint facility, as Craig was mentioning, or Councilman Coates was mentioning, with the detention, which is a flood control function. That's not a requirement of the state. That's a requirement for flood control purposes. But it works as a dual use to help clean up the water if it's done correctly. Slows the water down, allows the sediment to drop out. It's easy to make that function as a dual purpose.
I understand the separation between flood control and MS4.
Okay, flood control is the detention basin. So that's where we're going to slow the water down. We're going to store it for a period of time at a metered release rate. That metered release rate is typically the exact same release rate as the property where the development occurred historically discharged. Now, the nature of that discharge changes some no matter what, just because of the development itself, but we try and maintain the same discharge flow rates in cubic feet per second, how much water is coming off the site at any given time. In exchange for that, we allow that discharge to continue for a longer period of time. That's where the pond comes in. So the volume is increased because of the hard surface that doesn't, no water percolates into the rooftops, the roadways, the driveways, all that other stuff. That's where the pond comes into play, because there is an increase in volume of water.
It's and the time it gets there.
Exactly.
Time, big point is that your
Time is huge.
is because it's getting there faster.
Exactly. So that's where the pond comes into play. It stores that initial surge of water coming off of the hard surface and holds it back at a historic flow rate, which is, in theory, should be the same as the pre-developed condition.
So what are the conditions under MS4 for contaminants, or the EPA regulations, non-flood control regulations that are currently in place?
Okay, the MS4 permit deals entirely with water quality.
Right.
So they want to have zero sediments.
So when I say currently in place, I mean prior to this change.
Prior to this change is mostly sediment control. And our water bodies do not have limitations for example, a lot of the northern Utah communities, I know Springville specifically, has some restrictions for nitrogen and phosphorus. So they're doing additional measures above and beyond what we are, because of the water bodies that are receiving their discharges. So they have issues associated with lawn fertilizers, runoff from feedlots, any of that kind of stuff, and any of the runoff that's coming in that is high in nitrogen or phosphorus content. They're making them filter out them nutrients before it reaches the water body. In our environment here, our main contaminant that we're discharging is sediment, which I disagree with their take on that. I feel like that our development actually decreases the amount of sediment that the river receives, with the exception of construction activity. The construction activity is a big deal. There's a lot of sediment that is generated from that wouldn't historically be going.
Give me an example of that, will you?
Well, so I just want to touch on that, and that's when the MS4 came in. That was a problem we had in the community. Is the construction sites were a mess. You didn't have control of the contractor, and they didn't have to do all these we call them BMP, best management practices, to stop the sediments, to like dirt berms or silt fences to stop sediments from leaving, because you've taken all the vegetation off the top, and it rained or you're watering it and it pushes it, or the wind blows. I mean, the wind never blows in southern Utah, but it just is constantly moving the dirt off the site, and it wouldn't have had that if I had the vegetation on it, the natural vegetation. But around here it does a little bit because we're in a desert. But
And I'd agree with you, Lester. I don't see the sediment as being inherently bad, because that's a natural process that takes place for millions and millions of years. I just wanted to mention, while I was thinking about it, last week I'd met with Senator Lee's aide. His name's Heath Hansen. And we talked briefly about this. And I've asked our mayor if he would join with me and go visit with him and just see. I guess what I'm getting at is to see if there's any parameters that we might be able to investigate where, in my opinion, the rest of the state really isn't in our same situation. We may be in the same, right, that category, but because of our soils and stratas and faults and the arid temperatures and a number of factors, it just seems like that we should be in a different category, different system. There may not be any way around it, but I just thought it'd be worth our time to investigate it and see.
So that's the current sediment control in here. So unless you feel like.
Right now we have three specific ordinances that are in place. One of them is our illicit discharge ordinance, which that is pretty much targets commercial and industrial applications, to prevent, for example, runoff from a mechanic shop where they're spraying out the bays and spraying the oils and the petroleum products and whatever garbage and debris is on the floor into the storm drains. That's creating the sheens on the water, that kind of stuff. That ordinance is in place and has been since 2007. We also have an erosion and sediment control ordinance, which is the grading manual I was talking with you about, that implements all of the best management practices, the requirements for the grading permit, the inspections, all that stuff to make sure that we're doing what we can from that perspective. And the third one that is a big deal is the post-construction ordinance, which accommodates the maintenance of the facilities that are being installed to incorporate these other ordinances and these other requirements to do what we can to clean up the water that's coming off of the developed land as opposed to the undeveloped land.
Lester, would you tell us a little bit about the Dixie Area Stormwater Coalition?
The Stormwater Coalition is, we're not a formal entity of the county or anything like that, such as the Flood Control Authority. It's kind of a coalition of the MS4 communities that are down here. So we've got Washington City that's a member, St. George City is a member, Santa Clara City is a member, and Ivins City are members. And we get together on a monthly basis just to talk about, all of the other requirements of the permit, our public education and outreach that we do, some of our municipal operations, because we're watched over pretty heavily by the state as well, and just trying to keep everybody basically going down the same road with these requirements, because we're all being hit with them. We've all got the same requirements. The permit was issued on a statewide level. Like I was telling you last time we talked, there are a few specific permits that were issued to individual cities. And that was kind of to accommodate some of their unique components that they had within their city, whether it be a specific nutrient that they were dealing with, or some questions or concerns that they had that they figured a way to work around that worked out a little bit better for them. I know that it took them an awful lot of time and effort to get them individual permits issued. And one of the hard things with going down that road of an individual permit is you lose your ability to collaborate with other communities on whatever issues you're requesting a variance from.
And Lester, you're the board member from Washington, is that right?
Yes.
Good, thank you.
So so this is, you got your three ordinances here that you're talking about, the sediment control. So now we're into the brave new world of what are you referring to this as? It's not, because phase 2 actually started in 2007.
Right. This is our latest permit. So it's still part of the phase 2 requirements, and they're implementing additional components to all of the phase 2 cities. And this is, like I said, this is on a statewide level. This isn't just Southern Utah. This is all the communities in the state, even the individual permits. I've read them all, and they all have this same verbiage in them for the low impact development requirements.
So then, okay, so just run back over. So, because basically what I'm understanding is that now, instead of just the delay and retention, every property going forward that is built after we put this in place and adopt this regulation has to actually retain it on their property, and now can no longer allow it to actually drain off the property. It actually has to drain through different mediums that are created to silt beds and what was the tree thing? What was
Free box.
tree boxes?
The requirement that we're presented with now, our current requirement requires detention for flood control. So we allow them to discharge everything just over an extended period of time. They're still allowed to discharge all of the water.
Okay.
The requirement that we're presented with now, from the state with our new permit, is a retention with an R, which means that we must retain, which is keep on site, and not discharge the 80th percentile storm. And that's based off of the official rain gauge that's in St. George, that's got, I think it's got about 120 years of data on it, if I'm not mistaken now. And we go through, crunch the numbers on that data, go through everything, and basically throw out all of the flukes, any snow events, anything, throw out all of the data that's on the very bottom end and the very top end. And then we take the 80th percentile event of the remaining data. And in our location down here, that equates to 0.44 inches of water is what's considered to be the 80th percentile event.
And that has to now be retained on the property without any drainage,
With no discharge,
no discharge.
unless, and this is the road that we went down with our guidance document that you guys have all hopefully had an opportunity to review, unless it can be shown to be technically infeasible.
So how feasible are these measures? I mean, we're talking about retaining stormwater from running off, and I'm seeing things like rain gardens and bioretention cells and bioswells and vegetation strips and all of these things that I've never heard of. And I'm thinking, while I haven't heard of many of these approaches, I have tried to dig in soil around here, and it's hard, and it's clay, and it's not something that absorbs water easily. I mean, how realistic is this on a residential and commercial application?
A good portion of the time, it is not realistic. And that's what we tried to highlight with this document, is to go through and define the technical infeasibilities of it.
That Councilman City, that's, oh, sorry, Lester. I didn't
So in a nutshell, that's what this document tried to do. And I feel like we did a really thorough job at it, defining when it becomes infeasible. For example, the depth of bedrock, the depth of groundwaters, expansive soils, proximity to infrastructure, to homes, all that stuff. And that's what this document did, was set forth a specific criteria for them to look at and say, can we feasibly do this? Or can we deem it to be technically infeasible? If we can deem it to be technically infeasible, the next criteria in the permit stipulates that we don't have to do it in its entirety, but we do have to do it to the maximum extent practical, which we have tried to give some guidance on that as well, to say, can we meet the terms of the permit to a portion and call that the maximum extent practical? And I think if we can get to that point, we can satisfy the state and satisfy the terms of the permit.
So as far as practical, we've got on one end of our city, we have the, expandable soils that you just mentioned. On the other end, down in by Suki Farms, we have soluble soils.
Exactly.
So doesn't that add an element of, what's practical? I mean, doesn't that put us in a...
It does,
And-
dramatically.
Here,
Has anybody had an opportunity to look at the spreadsheet?
I have.
We've got some of the tables in there, and we've got a flow chart that I feel like would probably help you guys a lot.
Lester, what kind of flow are we talking about here?
Go ahead and pull that spreadsheet up and let's go through it. I mean, honestly, in some of these documents, I didn't have a sufficient amount of understanding of the issue to really digest. But if you want to pull that up for us and take us
Yeah,
through.
let me pull up a screen share here real quick.
So
I'm
I
gonna
want,
quickly-
while you're doing that, Lester, I wanted to bring up, like, I think one of my concerns is just looking at how I would approach is I could probably find a reason to make it infeasible on almost every project in this town.
Mhm.
But if I submit that and I have a disagreement with the city engineer, say he doesn't think so, how is that? I don't want to say the
Well,
word.
And that's where I think we go down the road of the maximum extent practical. And I think we've come up with a pretty good out for that. That I feel like we can satisfy the state with the documentation that we've been able to
But with,
provide with this.
give me an example, Lester. Are you talking about the on the lot, the
Well,
disconnect on each lot?
right, do an impervious disconnect, because we actually, part of the process that we went through with J.E. Fuller and Associates, we ended up coming up with a scenario where, how do we get to the maximum extent practical and don't go into a treatment perspective? Because that's the other option, is that we now start treating all of our stormwater. Whether that be through a conventional treatment plant or through biological means, which I don't, just the amount of effort that would be required to do that is just unsurmountable. It would be unbelievable to consider treatment of the stormwater discharges.
And the ongoing maintenance of it.
Exactly.
But we're also, my thing that I have a problem with is now all of a sudden we've pushed this all onto the private property owners of their lots.
And that's something that that the council needs to keep in mind when these proposals are presented with them, or presented to you guys. It doesn't have to be on the individual lots. And from a staff perspective, we would prefer that it wasn't. We would prefer that it was centralized somehow, rather than be in their detention basin. You know, they could make some modifications to their basin to accommodate it, or whether it be in open space corridors. You know, maybe they do some vegetated planter strips outside the right of way of both sides of the roads, that is maintained by the homeowners association, or maybe it's limited common area, something to that effect. I think there's a lot of options that don't have to be on each individual property.
And I agree with you, Lester, on that there is other options, but all those other options still have ground that doesn't discharge into the, I mean, say it's a class D, it's a clay
Yep.
material.
Right.
It doesn't discharge, so it's infeasible is in my mind. In
Right.
my opinion, any soil that cannot percolate the water in, it's infeasible.
Right. And I tend to agree.
And we have to stop at that point. We have to stop and say it's not feasible because of the soil. And I know, and I know you bring up the fact that it's, as long as we can claim that the soil is infeasible, it is not required in my mind, and we move on. And any means practical, that is any means. The soil currently doesn't take it, so why are we making our soil to take it now?
Right.
At that point, in my mind, it stops right there, and that's where I think we need to stop it. Now, I'm talking totally residential. If it's a commercial, that's totally different in my mind than a residential unit, because they have means and effort of retaining the water. They, in their site, they're usually a dirtier site. Usually they're all asphalt, all building, not a lot of thing. But there are those, I've seen it done. I've done it in a site where we did retention, where it went through, they had a little landscape area out front. We just ran it through that and did the LID in that.
Mm-hmm.
That's a way to do it.
Well, and I tend to agree with you, but I don't think that the state is going to go for that. I think they're going to say, they're going to look at the next portion of the permit that stipulates to the maximum extent practical.
And
They're going to say that that's not practical.
But
You
how
could
does our,
have put rain barrels up.
so Lester, how does, when you say the maximum extent practical, how does our soil type down here, how does it play into that? Is that not a
It does play into it.
mitigating factor?
It does play into it.
To what extent though? Is it something that you can bank on, or is it something that's just going to be entered into an equation for different types of mitigation?
It's all going to go into an equation. The soil type. Let me do a screen share here real quick with you, and kind of just go through just a simple flow chart that we created. Can everybody see that okay, or do I need to zoom in some more?
Now let's zoom in
Not
some
for
more.
20 years.
So this is the flow chart that we created for our area down here. The state has got some that are similar to this, but they go a lot more in depth into stuff that we kind of determined was infeasible. Just does not fit our area down here. The state gave us an example of 10 different best management practices that we could use to accomplish this. And part of the permit required that we must allow and go in detail with a minimum of 5 of them 10.
Sorry, can you say that again? 5 of what?
5 of the 10 that they created. So if we go to page 7, this is their sheet of the BMPs that they came up with, stipulating the rain gardens, the bioretention swells, the bioswells, vegetative strips, green roofs, pervious surfaces, underground infiltration galleries, harvest and reuse. That's the 10 that the state came up with, and they stipulated to us that we must allow and go into detail with a minimum of 5 of them.
Hey, Lester,
Yes.
can I just jump in real quick? I just want to read what this table is named: Utah DWQ LID BMP. It's like a foreign language if you're not doing this all the time. What do you
I
mean?
agree.
Division of water quality, low impact design, and best management practices. It makes
Yes.
common sense to
Yes,
me.
for a land surveyor, you would know that. But for me, these are terms that I'm like, okay, I'm looking at just the table, and then I look down to trying and determining rain garden, bioretention cell, bioswell. I mean, I'm sorry. I'm just learning the language here.
Councilman Staley, what's interesting, you looked at it from that angle, and mine was, as I was sitting here thinking of my experience in my business, where I, over the years, had people request, like rain barrels and underground recollection and reuse and recharge kind of systems and wells and things. And those things are nice in theory, but they're very hard and expensive to actually get them to be really productive in practical terms.
Practice.
But
And that's been our argument with the state on this from the very beginning is, we can make it work on paper. We can design whatever we need to and say, hey, this works. But the practicality of it is, that's where we went with this feasibility study that we did, and determining, is this even feasible to do here? Can it even possibly accomplish what the intention is? And so if you look on this table, we've got 5 of these that are highlighted in green. These are the 5 that we looked at and we said, hey, these are potentially usable in our southern Utah environment with the limitations that we've got. What is potentially doable in this location. And I'm still this harvest and reuse with the rain barrels. I still struggle with that one because even though you can say that, yeah, that's doable in any location, there's no way to make it actually accomplish anything.
I don't, with the soils we have though, you can't reuse it. You're just saying put it on your grass.
That's what they're saying. Put it on your grass, put it in your container plants.
But isn't one of the other requirements that you can get out is from cost?
Cost is one of the criteria.
So when I look at this now, sorry, I understand where Lester's coming from. I'm not trying to beat up on it because I think they did a good job, but I think the state's being way overboard on this. The soil doesn't account for it. Say it goes to any extent, you put it in rain barrels. That's an additional cost on our homeowners. We have a home issue now with affordable housing, and we're asking them to add additional costs to their house so that we can, so the state's telling us we have to have affordable housing. On the other end, they're telling us that, hey, but you got to implement all this expensive stuff to go down the road and fertilize. How's that? It's just contrary to what they have. So they can't have both. So we have to make a choice, and we have to end it somewhere and say, okay, that's fine. We will do your report and determine it's non-feasible if it's non-feasible. And if it's feasible, the feasible reason is to percolate into the ground. If anything can't percolate into the ground or naturally doesn't percolate into the ground, then how can you tell me it's feasible?
So
And that was what we dove in depth into with this document. And let's go through this flow chart a little bit, and I'll give
before you move off that topic, you said that you didn't think that it was feasible to harvest and reuse.
Not that it's not feasible. I believe that it's always feasible to do that. I don't think we can come up with a way to say that it's infeasible.
Oh, I see.
Because you could harvest the rainwater and then someone could get out there and
So that's-
open the hose and put it on their grass.
Are you saying that's the only one that you can't see infeasibility in this?
I can't see that you can pull that completely out of the equation and say that it's infeasible.
You know, another factor, Lester, that I was thinking about is we've talked about the different area that we have down here as far as soils and that type of thing. But we also have a much different weather than what the state has. Our rainfall is, what is it, 3 or 4 inches a year or something? Maybe 10, like 10. And up north, 30 or 40. And so again, it just comes back to, I just wonder, Lester, and this is just a off shooting from the hip question, but has it ever been considered that maybe this could be brought about by having people on the ground that would do a site-by-site inspection and say, this is what you could do to qualify for this, and do that rather than just one blanket everything and one size fits all?
Well, and that's kind of what we've done with this document, is to allow the engineering community to go through that process as they're doing the design on the development. And we're more than happy to help them, to give them some ideas, to give them some guidance. And that's, like I was saying, if we go down through the flow chart and it's deemed to be infeasible across the board, it's just infeasible, then we resort to the maximum extent practical. And my firm belief is that even though the state has issued this harvest and reuse, and I can't come up with a way of saying that it's completely infeasible to do that, the appendices to this document with the Bowen and Collins work that they did for us on the disconnected impervious, we were able to show that simply by disconnecting the impervious areas of the lots and disallowing the rain gutters to be piped directly to the street, and connecting it in essence, because you're in a pipe all the way through. It doesn't run across the land anywhere. It comes off the roof, down the rain gutter, into a pipe, and immediately to the street. It never sees the soil anywhere. It has no opportunity for infiltration.
But Lester, and I didn't mean to cut you off, but that's the very reason why we're different down here. We have to do that to keep the water off what people call the blue clay, the Chinle Formation, because that's what creates the swell, and it creates the soils that, and essentially that's what caused the Quill Creek Dam to break and for hundreds of houses to slip off their foundation. But that's the very reason that we need to focus on what our specific, and I know that this is nothing with you, but just I'm speaking in generalities, that we need to focus on what our community has to bear, because it's just different down here. It just is.
Well, and that's,
hey, listen, this is Starkey, and I just wanted to throw this out here because this keeps running past my mind, because we've seen this over the decades down here, and that is, even though we're evaluating this, discussing it, we'll be adopting it as an individual municipality. Isn't the reality also that, we don't live in an island here? Whatever the regulations, whatever the ordinance we approve and start to implement, because in order to compete with, in order for our citizens who are going to live in our city to compete also with developers in just adjacent cities who should be implementing the same federal than state program, don't we almost have to have basically the same ordinance approval process and therefore expenses that are going to have to go into, irrespective of what it comes out to be, they're going to have to be the same almost as St. George, or we could get played. Our contractors could get played because they're letting things, for example, slide on the St. George side in terms of approvals being more lenient, and therefore it's more costly in Washington. And there's got to be part of it because it's happened over the years with us.
Well, and you know, back to the question on the soil conditions, with all of this down here and the expansive blue clays, the collapsibles, the gypsiferous soils, all of them other components that we've got, that's part of the reason that, you know, one of the very first things that they've got to do before they even start this design is to get their geotechnical work done and find out what the limitations are, because that's the very first component that we look at in the flow chart.
So can you take us through that flow chart, Lester?
Yeah.
And so that's basically step one, is to understand, step 1 or 2, to understand what kind of soil you're dealing with.
Very first step. Step 1 is vertical clearances. The first thing you're doing is you're looking at your depth to bedrock and your depth to groundwater.
So vertical, you're talking down.
Down.
We're going down. We're
right.
vertical from the bedrock up.
Right.
Okay.
So that's the first thing you're looking at. They will go out there with their geotech. So this breaks out and tells you to see the matrix for the criteria. The matrix is on the very next page.
And so if we hit a no, we're done. It's unfeasible.
Exactly.
And
So
if we hit yes, we go on.
We'll just use a vegetated strip for this example. So in order to even consider using a vegetated strip, you need to have your depth of groundwater greater than 10 feet. You need to have your depth to bedrock greater than 5 feet. It's HSG, and I'm very well aware how much you guys like the acronyms, but the document would be 10 times the size if we didn't use them. That stands for the hydrologic soil group. So the only time that a vegetated strip would be considered usable would be in a type A or a type B soil. The next component that you're looking at is the infiltration rates of the soil.
So how do I know what a type A or type B soil even is?
They have classification. The geotech will tell you in his report.
You gotta
Okay,
ask
I don't have to know that.
No, you have to know.
The geotech is
Geotech. No. Okay.
the other thing that they've got to do is they've got to establish what the infiltration rates of the soil are. So how accepting of the water
Like
is.
how soluble it is, essentially, or
So how fast the water will percolate through it.
Actually percolate into it.
So if it's
Okay.
a clay, it doesn't go through.
Exactly. So that
like-
has to be a minimum of 0.5 inches per hour.
You'd be rock.
It's either rock or mush.
Right. The next component that you look at is the expansive or collapse risk. You know, in order to use this vegetative strips, we must be in a low to moderate risk associated with it. So, for example, Councilman, you were mentioning the blue clays that we have. You could not use the vegetative strips in the blue clay environment. Next component we want to look at is the gypsiferous content. You know, have we got solubles? Is the material just going to simply go into the water solution and cause a collapse of the soil? The next component we want to make sure that we're looking at is the liquefaction risk, which comes into the equation in an earthquake environment. You're looking to make sure that the soil in an earthquake doesn't turn into a liquid. Basically, you're wanting to make sure that it's solid enough to support that. The next thing you would look at would be, so that covers your vertical clearance, which is the first parameter of the flow chart. So the next component of the flow chart is, well, we actually got into some of these already. The acceptable native soils. So the hydrologic soil groups, the infiltration rates, the expansive and collapse potential, the gypsiferous soils. The next component would be your horizontal clearances. You want to look at proximity to buildings, to roads, to water sources, whether that be wells or surface sources, areas within the floodplains. We want to make sure that if we are infiltrating water, that we're not causing any damages in the floodplain or adjacent to water sources. The other components are underground pipelines and infrastructure. We want to make sure that we're looking that we're not infiltrating water where, you know, directly adjacent to, say, the regional 60-inch diameter pipeline. We cause a collapse on that, and we're going to cause a water shortage for the entire community.
So let me ask you this, Lester. If we do these biolus wells on these lots and all of a sudden the street infrastructure starts collapsing, there's another reason why it's infeasible.
Exactly. So that's
we have that issue.
In order for us to say it's infeasible, we have to define the feasibility, and that's what this document is doing, is giving definition to all of the questions that you guys have got.
But this was made up by the group you hired to do it. This is
Correct.
us deciding it.
With input from the coalition.
Yeah, okay. But just, this is a guidance. This isn't, I don't want this to be our fast and rule. This is just a guidance. I don't want us to pull this up and say, okay, you have to meet all these to make it work, because you might have a different method on it.
Ultimately, it's going to boil back to the geotechnical engineer's recommendations. It really is. What the risk potential is, what the concerns are associated with it.
So Lester, I'm sitting here thinking about why I'm so frustrated with this. And I think what I'm feeling is I'm frustrated because it's going to create such an increase in cost to homeowners to be, you know, and with the geotech and the implementation of these things, it's just going to cost more. Can you please just give a little breakdown on what the increased cost is estimated to be? I think we talked about it before, but I would appreciate it if you could just kind of go over that and just give us just rough parameters of what we're looking at per home or per door or whatever the situation is.
And we did not dive into that specifically because there are so many variables associated with it. If you look at page 13 of this document, we did dive in a little bit just as an overall based on some national studies that have been done. Let me see if I can find that page here real quick. Just upon some national studies that have been done and looking at costs, you know, these are based on studies from the impact of infrastructure from LLC and Stantec in 2014 in arid regions. You know, they went through these different LID practices and said, okay, which of these costs the most from the initial installation perspective, and which ones cost the most to maintain.
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically all the adaptation that we were able to get. It's 100% dependent upon the chosen solution. You know, for example, the harvest and reuse, you know, they consider that the rain barrels, the initial cost of the rain barrel is actually pretty inexpensive, which if you think about it, it really is.
But but that's not just for what's coming off your roof, right? You've got to account for what's coming off your driveway as well.
Yes and no. If you can collect it all from the roof, you know, we've got an example in here.
80th percentile of your whole site, and you might be able to get all that from the roof.
Exactly. So, you know, for example, here's a a simple example that they put together. You know, they didn't define everything associated. They didn't say, you know, hey, they basically said, okay, LID is acceptable for use in this particular 4-lot, 1-acre subdivision. So the overall subdivision is 1 acre. They want to divide it into 4 lots. They went through, they defined that the overall impervious area that is being created by the development, which would be the roads, driveways, rooftops, patios, whatever they may have associated with it. The impervious area is 35% of the overall subdivision. They went through the equation, they calculated everything out, and they come up with a solution to the question that they need to retain 206 cubic feet for the entire subdivision, which in gallons, which everybody's more familiar with, that equates out to, come on, Craig, you're quick.
I'll just let you do it, Lester.
There you go. That equates out to 1,541 gallons, basically, that they need to retain for the entire 1 acre parcel.
It's quite a misnomer to say barrel.
Yeah, depending on what, right?
Well, in Utah, the requirement is you can retain in rain barrels, you can't keep any more than 250 gallons per unit. So if there's 4 units on this development, they're only able to retain 1,000 gallons of that 1,500. So even doing rain barrels, they're not able to accommodate the requirement. But you could say, depending upon the soil's conditions, you could say that that was the maximum extent practical if the decision was that they wanted to do rain barrels.
But how do you have a, so you have to all do, remember, you got to do this before the person buys their home.
Correct.
It's going to be
That's
mandated.
where the-
They're going to be mandated to say, oh, by the way, you have to have rain barrels on your home and you're going to have to maintain them and maintenance. And by the way, we're going to inspect you on it.
Right.
But so
Yeah.
let's,
We actually ran an example. It's in the appendices that Bowen and Collins had worked through. I had them look at numerous different single family environments, everything from half-acre lots down to 6,000 square foot lots. And the worst condition, absolute worst condition scenario that we were able to come up with was a 6,000 square foot lot with a sizable home on it. That in a category D soil, so the worst soil conditions that we could come up with. And just by disconnecting the impervious, we could show that just by disconnecting the rain gutters, not connecting them to the street, that they were able to infiltrate. Now, whether it truly happens or not, I'm not even gonna, you can't measure it. So I'm not even gonna assume whether it truly happens or not, but we can show on paper that they were able to infiltrate more than 300 gallons per lot. So my opinion is that we can deem that as the maximum extent practical. We did more doing that than we did with rain barrels.
So Lester, you're using these percentages and numbers. Now, is this based on like 35% of our annual rainfall here in Southwest Utah, or is it a?
That 35% is based on the impervious cover.
Right, I mean, that was just an example. Just,
Right.
were they using our rainfall?
They were. That's
Our
right.
areas?
0.44.
that's what the 0.44 was, is that's our area. Every
Okay.
Salt Lake has a different one that we do.
So at that 0.44 is.
Is our area. That's correct.
So, both areas of my experience, as I look through all these different options, the bioswale is what we've had the most success with, because you can really incorporate it into your landscaping for not a lot of extra charge, and it creates a nice feature in your landscaping because you've got rocks and cover anyway. But I'm just trying to figure how you could get it to do what they want it to, because it has to have a termination point. You can't just because it won't, like you said, you can make it work on paper, but in practical terms, the water's not going to soak in as fast as it's going to fill and run off. So anyway.
Yes, exactly. And that's absolutely correct. But what they're looking at is they actually want it to fill. They want it to fill up and retain that 0.44 inches. The rain event will overfill it. That's the intention behind it. Then the water runs off. But after that water runoff has occurred, that water continues to percolate in or be used up by plants or evaporate. That's the water that they are trying to keep. They're not, and that needs to be completely clear with this whole thing. This is in addition to our flood control. We do not want to back off from our detention requirements in exchange for this, because this is minuscule compared to the flood control requirements that we've got in place already.
And just help me to remember, I apologize if you've already covered this. Does this apply to all homes in our city or just new construction, or what is the parameters for that?
It would be anything vested from the adoption date forward. Anything that's already vested would maintain that vesting as they were approved. We will not go retroactive with this. Even though the state has some verbiage in there saying that we're supposed to, and I don't know how we possibly could. Maybe Council Starkey could help with that, but I don't know how we can go back and tell somebody they have to do something.
Well, I think enforcement of this is just it's so difficult, no matter how you look at it. Enforcement and across the board consistency with it, and compared to how it's going to be handled in St. George versus Washington, there's so many issues here that yeah, I mean, I have a little bit of a brain freeze when I just think about application of this thing, but yeah.
So you got that example pulled up right there, Lester.
Yes, this one.
That's the bioretention cell.
Yeah, that's the bioretention well. And this, this doesn't necessarily need to be immediately adjacent to the home. I mean, it could be out, behind the sidewalk. It could be about anywhere, really.
But it can. But our standard home doesn't have that much room around here. The standard home we heard last night is the 19 whatever 57. It was, 57 square feet lot. And so with a small home, affordable housing, back to that, to get us away with our dirt, because of the soil, they're asking us to now add additional cost to amend the soil. I mean, this little detail is, hey, let's put in you got some topsoil, some engineered native soil, a base course, some peat gravel, some fabric. Oh, and by the way, then let's pipe it after it gets through all that and take it to the same location.
Exactly.
It's insane. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. Now we're requiring everyone to do that. And then, oh, by the way, I keep bringing it up and certify it's done and it's working. I don't even know how we certify that it's working. Do you have to go do potholes and test pits and make sure that their soil infiltration is working? It's all unfeasible.
Yeah, why don't you talk a little bit about that as far as what the city is planning to do as far as inspections?
Can I say one thing
Sure.
before that?
Sure.
I have as big of a deal if our soil percolated. Our soil just doesn't percolate. That's my hang up. If it's in Green Springs where it's pure sand, it's totally different to me than out in the fields where there's more of this bad soil than not. What was the percentage, Lester, on C and D versus A and B in the county? We had that exhibit. I just can't remember the percentage.
Yeah, it's in here. I believe we were, I want to say 43% in Washington.
That's C and D. So easy math, 50% is feasible, 50 is not. So if you got
We don't have a heat map showing this.
In Washington City, within our city limits,
comprehensive.
Now, keep in mind, our city limits include a whole bunch of the reserve, the turtle reserve, which is a huge portion of that. In Washington City itself, we have 43.7% AMB. I can actually pull that up on the screen here real quick. Page 3 of the document. So, you know, and you have to take into consideration too that of that, you know, we've got bedrock that's within 5 feet of the surface too. So even though these, in my opinion, the LID practices work in these A and B soils. B's kind of touch and go. A is a for sure. They would work exceptionally well. So you've got 43% of Washington City is an A or a B, but 34.9% of that, the bedrock's within 5 feet.
And Lester, not only that, within 5 feet, but in certain areas, groundwater is within 3 to 4 feet.
The fill says it's loaded with groundwater too.
So
So I want to ask you another question. Lester.
probably only 10% of Washington City that this makes reasonable sense in.
So I'm going to ask a real technical question. So because we're talking about these A, B, and C, but a lot of times when you're doing your drainage, you've got A, B's, and C's and D's on some areas. And so you might have an A, you might have a D. Are we going to take the average mean? So you look at the CN value and you're at 87 for one and 60 for the other, and the average mean ends up being closer to a C on average. Is that the one we're going with?
Well, in my opinion, what you would do in that environment is you would break, because you're going to do it anyways, break each of them soil types up to an individual drainage basin.
But say you're doing mass grading, because now you're saying we got to have 2 detention basins, and you're going to do mass grading. You're going to mix the soils to do a development.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you want to try to shoot to have your detention in that A? Yeah, for sure. But sometimes with the contour of the land, it doesn't work. You might have A up above and D below. And you're doing mass grading, but
This is going to be, you're going to be looking at the soil types in the location of your proposed LID improvement.
okay.
Say that again.
But it affects your entire development. That's why I asked the question.
Yes, it will.
So if we're proposing it, then we can propose it wherever it deemed necessary for the detention requirements. And when the detention requirement is classified a D, then we can look at the full retention if we decide to put our LID in that. I hope I'm being clear. I'm probably not, because I'm being technical. Does that make sense to you, Lester? Or was I?
It does. It does. And that's where we go down the road of the maximum extent practical. And I think that's the thing that we really need to hang our hat on is the maximum extent practical. It's infeasible for all of these reasons. And that's what the state said that we had to do was.
But who determines the maximum extent possible?
Right.
Who is that?
The city, right?
I'm asking that.
That's what he's proposing here, is he's putting forth guidelines to help guide
I know, and I'm
the builder or the engineer into the city's regulations, and then the city.
But
That's why I'm asking about the inspection.
But I think it has to go back to who's designing it. Who's taking the liability and writing the report? It's the engineering community. They're saying, hey, it's infeasible for these reasons. And I think the city has to accept that. If the city says, well, we don't agree with you, then if we can prove why, just because everybody's a little different, but this drainage stuff it's technical stuff, but there's so many different methods. You could do one method of drainage and another method and get different results.
Lester, can you respond to that?
Yeah, I was just trying to find it real quick because we've got in here. So
while you're looking, Lester, I was just going to say that no matter what, even if you go down this road of maximum extent practical, after you have a geotech, it's still going to create additional charges for the homeowner. You know, and that was more of a comment than a question, but
It's going to incur costs all around.
yeah, so as you go through the flow chart, you know, ultimately you look at all your soil types, you go through all of this. Say, for example, we're just in a horrible condition. We answered no to any one of these components. and it kicked us over here. The next thing we're looking at, is there an option for an under drain system? Because that's what the state regulates and tells us that we have to look at. If there is, that's where we go into the filtration system, like Craig was talking about, that now connects to the storm drain system, to see if there's an outfall condition to go through that filtration option. That's why I keep going back to the disconnected impervious, because then we're using that overland area as the filter, basically, to say that that's the maximum extent practical. So once you get to that component, you know, this goes through all your guidance, the steps that we just went through. The last paragraph stipulates that if an acceptable downstream outfall does not exist and other limitations cannot be mitigated in some form or another, pending the detailed analysis of your particular site and your design, or is cost infeasible, the selected BMP is not applicable for use within the coalition region, which that's kind of the way we've stipulated it. And an alternative approach may be requested. So this defines the alternative approach. If the user identifies that the available LIDMP that meets the intent of the Utah DEQ permit do not meet the criteria presented within the matrix, a request for an alternative approach shall be sought. In applying for the alternative approach, either for use of non-regional approach, so if they choose one of the other 5 BMPs that we didn't choose off of the state's list, we have to allow that. But we consider that to be an alternative approach. A site-specific engineering study shall demonstrate the ability to meet the intent of the general permit will be required. The alternative will be submitted to the local jurisdiction for approval. And we've left it at that. Because I feel like if they're going to submit an alternative approach to meeting the requirements, that's something that the council should make that decision on.
So each time.
Each time.
Yeah, but the council typically doesn't have the background to understand this technical background.
Especially a future council that's not involved in the initial approval of the ordinance, because
Yeah, guys that aren't into it. Like we
unless
are.
you're doing it as a profession or have a geology degree and
I have
install rain
that,
gutters.
but I still
mean-
don't understand.
Well, and that's where council would be looking heavily at staff. They would be, you know, listening to the approach from the geotechnical engineer. You know, staff's gonna have a recommendation if it comes to your level for that alternative approach, because and that's the reason I keep leaning on this disconnected impervious, is if we can go down that road, it doesn't have to be a decision every time.
Hey, Lester, is it possible for the city council to designate an approving an authority board, similar to we have in other situations where they're highly technical, and the council approves an authority board, and that authority board hears those particular issues? Is that possible?
Yes, we could go down that pretty easily.
So it just seems like a lot of
additional layer of government.
it's another layer of government, and then all of a sudden I'm with Lester. I look at LID as this. Water it'd be nice to clean it up before we get it back in, but they're wanting us to percolate it in.
Right.
I get that. I wish we could. It makes sense. I wish we could all live on 2-acre lots with grass everywhere. It's not what we deal with down here.
But the contaminants that we're cleaning, again, I don't want to be redundant, they're natural occurring contaminants. It's not bio waste, or
It's not commercial. It's not industrial.
Well, I would say
It's
that,
just
look, if there's
natural.
not sediment flowing in the Virgin River, then it's not flowing. And those are the 2 waterways, right? The Virgin and the Santa Clara.
Well, for now, the main thing they're going after with us right now is the sediment. there will come a day where they will be requiring us to test our waters for nutrient contents, all kinds of stuff. That's probably going to be the next phase that they start implementing on us, requiring, during events that we've got people out there testing the discharges from the pipes to make sure that we're not contaminating the river.
Okay, so just to be clear, you're saying this, that these would come to the council anytime the applicant chooses something that's outside of the 5 selected by the city.
Right.
And then as far as the inspection, you would be doing an inspection on this at the plan level and design level, then at the site level, and then reoccurring on a monthly or biannual basis.
It would be an annual basis for the HOA or whoever's responsible for the post-construction management agreement. And typically in Washington, that's almost always the HOA in a residential environment. Very rarely is an individual, because their detention basin is common space. Commercial and industrial is a little different scenario, because them are big enough sites that they're doing their own. They would be doing
Straight
that.
zoning, residential, that's just straight zoning, not an HOA.
Well, we've still got the flood control that's going to have to be addressed. I don't know where else they're going to put their detention facility if it's not in a common area.
Unless it's a regional detention area.
Exactly.
I don't have an HOA because I have a regional detention, which is the Treasure Valley Park.
Right.
But it's pretty uncommon anymore, but it does happen.
So like I was saying, that yearly inspection happens by the homeowners association. And then the city, we're required to do an inspection on 20% of the facilities per year. So that's basically once every 5 years that we go do an inspection as well.
So we have 10,000 homes. You're going to go inspect 20% of those?
That's the reason I keep pushing toward the disconnected impervious.
Well, you
Because
should go
you
inspect that.
drive by and make sure that the rain gutters aren't piped to the street.
Yeah, but you're still going to have to go inspect that their swell's large enough and that they're doing their retention. And sounds like millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars that the city's going to have to pay for inspectors, and we don't have staff for that.
That's correct.
Well, and I don't want to be redundant, but if we take people's runoff that's now piped away from their house, which is what you're supposed to do in certain areas, so you don't have the expansive soil problem, then there going to be some liability when you don't allow them to do that, because it's almost contradictory geotechnical advice. I mean, they're absolutely contrary to each other in their concept and what they're trying to accomplish.
And most of the drainage studies that we see, that recommendation to get the water away from the house is for the first 10 feet.
And then by the guidance, you need another 40 feet to do your bioswale disconnect.
But you're changing the volumes here significantly.
I'm just saying.
So then, yeah.
I appreciate all the work that's done, but the more and more I look at it, it's so infeasible in 90% of our city. We just have to have our staff understand that it's infeasible in 90% of our city. Look at the report and understand that.
What form does the annual inspection done by the HOA take? They filling out a paper and sending it to the city?
Yes, we've got a form that we generated with our post-construction management ordinance that they fill out on a yearly basis. It has to be done by somebody with some expertise. There's a whole bunch of registered stormwater inspectors out there in the area. We allow a civil engineer with some drainage background to do it. You know, it just needs to be someone with some expertise to perform site inspection.
which creates more cost.
Exactly.
How do we keep, I mean, is it just on the HOA? How do they even know about this?
Since we implemented the ordinance, we have been sending out reminders to them on a yearly basis. There is going to come a day when we can't continue to do that.
A lot of the property management agencies, they understand this, I guess. And
Yes. Yeah, we've actually done some one-on-one trainings with the property management agencies. Ross just did one here probably a month ago on one that's doing, you know, they've got 10 or 12 different HOAs that they manage. And they just wanted to make sure that they understood what needed to be done. And we went and met with them and did one-on-one with them. Answered.
other cities around, they're doing the same thing.
Yes.
Are they as difficult as we are?
They will be, St. George will be presenting it if they haven't already. I think they said their second meeting in July, they were presenting it to their council. Santa Clara and Ivans, I don't know if they have yet or not. But they will be. I mean, our deadline was July 1.
I think we should invite the state to come talk to us about their permit. I'm all about just more discussion and understanding more.
You have to have something different than somebody from the EPA. That's not going to help you a bit. They'll just stone up right in the face and say, figure it out.
Well, that's fine, but more discussion, right? Like I'm just trying to.
No, I agree.
I
It
just
needs to be an elected official.
Well, then who's
somebody
the elected official
has
that's
some
over the
accountability.
EPA? Do we
Huh?
got to get the governor down here and talk to him?
I think it's federal, isn't it?
I think the federal has pushed it down to the state. The
Visual
states,
water quality, right? That agency on the state
Yeah,
level.
I'm not
It's kinda
saying.
rolling all the way down.
I just,
But it does
I
start
just
at the
think,
top.
I just think it's funny that they can just incur all these costs on us and just say, well, we're not going to give you any more federal funding. I mean, it just blows me away. Yeah,
So,
It was such a fuzzy.
so Russ, that was part of my comment earlier, and that is a reality of this type of an unfunded mandate that then ends up on our lap, which in reality ends up on the lap of homeowners as they start to figure out how they're going to pay for a home down here. And there's always that, to answer Councilman Coates, I think it would be great if we could just continue it, if we could not implement it based on the fact that we were still holding legitimate, intelligent conversations about how we want to implement this as a governmental body. But the reality is, that's the thing, is that if all the communities around us aren't implementing these unfunded mandates, the longer you don't enforce them as a city, it keeps more money in your pocket anyway. So, I mean, at some point, we've had that issue before with how we measure sewer costs on commercial projects when they come in, or runoff, is that we've got to be able to have oranges and oranges when our contractors are making a decision whether or not to put a subdivision in Washington versus St. George. And we from a practical standpoint, we probably all ought to be implementing these at the same time, just so the process is fair.
so
But if we can
Councilman
figure
or
out-
Council Starkey, are you suggesting that the council pass this with a condition that we be the third to last city in the region to put it in place? I'm just kidding.
or that we just store the funds in some type of bank account with the condition that the contractors can pull these funds at some point in the future if the state and federal government never ask us for proof of implementing the process. That's the problem with this. This is a massive process, and all lands, frankly, at Lester's front door, because Lester oversees these types of things, and it's a lot to be juggling.
Lester, help me understand here on the water barrel regulation, because I had thought, it's been a long time since I've seen this law. You referred to that it is 250 gallon limit. Is it per household, per property, or is it, or you could have multiple 250 gallon barrels, or, and I guess
It's per home. And you can have more than that. You could do a large cistern, but you have to get permitted through water rights for any more than that. It can be 250 per rooftop.
per rooftop. And then what about, what regulations do we have in the city as far as retaining water and creating a mosquito breeding ground?
That would be classified as a nuisance. And
What are the actual regulations? Can anybody speak to that?
that's something that we are going to have to dive into in the grading manual, because our current criteria stipulates that the water not remain there for more than a 24-hour period, I believe. But everything, as you go through all of the equations on this, that's part of what you're looking for, is how long that water is going to be there.
How long is it going to be there in some of these circumstances?
Well, that's the hard part of this whole equation. The state has in their head that this environment is going to work to retain this, that facility is going to be sitting there waiting with open arms to take water. Just the nuisance flow that we have that goes down the gutters is going to keep these things swampy, waterlogged messes. And I don't know a way around that.
So going forward, Lester, would you please just, as you're doing your work and research, just notice ways that we might be able to implement ways that would be the least expensive for our new homeowners? I mean, I understand there's a lot of moving targets and everything, but man, I just feel a great responsibility here to make sure we do all we can to minimize the financial burden, because, you know, I just am having a hard time seeing the actual benefit from this. I had a thought that, you know, if we had tea and enough water, we could throw the tea into the ocean like what happened in Boston, because a lot of this seems like a taxation without, you know, the representation. And I don't mean to be facetious, but that's kind of what it feels like to me, is that what are the homeowners getting out of this? How do they benefit? How does it enrich their lives? I mean, I don't want to be philosophical. It's just, it's frustrating.
And Lester, where does that responsibility lie? So if it's done that way, so again, because this is federal state mandated, let's say that we're not intentionally, because clearly we wouldn't intentionally not follow federal or state regulations, but let's say we have a choice between, you know, a more significant versus a less expensive process for a project. And we do that kind of on a regular basis because we want to err on the side of making it more sensible and affordable. So at the end of the day, in a federal or state audit of our management of that, it's determined that Lester was just a smidge too friendly on his determination, and they probably could have been stronger enforcement of it. Who gets hit with that? Because I kind of doubt at the time that we can go back to the developer from 10 years ago and say, we told you we were right on the edge. I mean, is that going to fall on the cities at that stage? The city's going to have to take care of that because it didn't so severely enforce it.
I have a suggestion. I appreciate the education I've received tonight. I actually feel like I am now at the bottom level threshold capable of actually rereading these documents. So maybe we close it up for the night and some about where we proceed from here. I'm honestly stumped. I really do want to do some more to go back to them. There's so much of this that I didn't understand. Trying to go through it, so I've got at least the background and then figure it out from there.
Do we want to do it again as a special workshop?
I think we need to keep talking.
I kind of do too, but I need time to go back.
I would actually measure the volume by the size of this clip that Denise gave with the papers.
You made the mistake of printing it.
I only printed the stuff that I really cared about. I've read the MS4 enough.
Oh, shoot.
Lester, thank you very much for your preparation and your information.
Thank you, Lester.
It's a lot to digest, I know. So do you want to do 2 weeks? Or do we have to get voting on this?
We got time.
2 weeks.
Let's talk about it. I mean,
Sure.
they took 3 years to make a decision.
And I wouldn't mind seeing how the other,
Communities are doing it?
yeah,
Okay.
just to kind of, I'd rather be not the first ones,
I agree.
somewhere in the middle to the end of the pack.
Lester, your Dixie group there that you have, I probably shouldn't use the word Dixie, but some of them for St. George, right? From all the communities. Lester, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Could you see where maybe St. George is at in Santa Clara and Ivans, Hurricane?
Yes, St. George, when I checked with them last, their intent was to have it on their second council meeting in July.
In
And
July.
I wanted to say that somewhere around about the 20th.
That's what I thought Mayor Pike said to me. So,
And Hurricane got out of it because of their proximity. They're just far enough away from the city of St. George that they're not.
is Santa Clara again?
I believe Santa Clara,
Ivans?
and I
Yep.
want to say Ivans, but Lester would know better than me. In fact, hold on, I can tell you, it's in this. It's in.
That's what it is. Ivan, Santa Clara, St. George, Washington.
Yes, those four. The lucky four.
But one thing I did want to bring up to Councilman Ivy's point on looking at the least expensive scenario. You know, I hate to keep bringing this up, but on the disconnected impervious, that's kind of the road that we were going down with that. Because that's really, if anything, it's a decrease in cost from a perspective of construction. You know, and that needs to be weighted, you know, against the potential risks, but that's where the geotechnical engineer comes into play.
Thank you.
Just, you know, just so everybody understands a little bit about these tables, there's a whole bunch of numbers here. The only thing that really matters when you're looking through that Bowen Collins stuff, the only thing that really matters is this very bottom number right here. That's how much we were able to show is saved on this particular lot, which is an R16 lot in a classified D soil, which would be the worst case condition. We're able to show that 288 gallons percolates, which is more than you could come up with a rain barrel on that home. And this is an actual home in Washington.
It's a great concept. And I agree with the fact that it does help on if you do this process, if the soil works and everything works, all the numbers work, that's great. But the regulation, I think, is overkill for single family residential homes. I'll shut up now.
I think we agree.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions or comments for Lester?
Just to tell Lester how much we appreciate his effort on this. We know that a lot of our frustration is in the program, and we appreciate your great presentation and your expertise. Thank you.
Just an observation. I just really feel like Councilman Coates keeps getting tied into just the reality and the logic of this, and I just can't see why he can't just get over that.
Well,
Just kidding.
I'll tell you what. You got Lester laughing. So,
With that, I am going to entertain a motion to adjourn this.
so moved.
I have a
Mayor.
motion. Yeah,
Did the council say they wanted to schedule it at a workshop or on a regular meeting? Because in 2 weeks is the holiday for the 24th along that area.
Let's just put it to a month. Let's push it off
Next
a month.
available. Yeah.
Yeah, let's push it off.
push
So-
it up to August 6th. You want to go on a Thursday again, or do you want to like a first Wednesday? Well, that would be
That's planning commission.
planning
Let's do
commission.
Thursday.
Thursday.
August 6th.
Do you want to do you want to just incorporate it as maybe a 10 or 15 minutes as part of our regular work session and not have to come for a separate
Okay.
meeting?
All right.
I don't know. I was thinking a separate one, but just
Well, we could, I can arrange, if it's something that we can table something else.
I can look at the first Thursday after our meeting.
Okay. Well, how about at our
August.
meeting workshop?
Okay. Whatever.
Okay. Okay, and then are we looking to put it on the regular agenda also?
that's the
Or-
12th though.
Just the workshop?
I think from my position, I think that right now I'd like to see how that next discussion goes before
Okay.
we put it on a regular agenda. But is
Right. That's a good move.
that okay?
Okay, thank you.
No, I don't think so.
No, we did not.
I think we just
Did we?
tabled it until we had a work session.
No, we had a work session. Table it to the next work session. Or not next, but in one in August.
So we are gonna have a meeting though on the 22nd, right?
We are, yes. I guess. Council, that's up to you.
I usually only celebrate Pioneer Day on the 24th.
Yeah, me too.
Okay,
If we don't, that next meeting is going to be really brutal. So we better.
That's an affirmative, Denise. We will have a meeting on the 22nd.
Yes, we have a workshop and a regular meeting.
Yes.
And you want that on the workshop?
No.
Are we doing?
Okay, thank you.
Are we going to do our joint meeting? So the 29th would be typically a fifth Wednesday. Just
Let me check with Jason, see what planning commission would like to do also, and I'll let you know. Plan on it. Let's plan on it.
okay.
And then, unless you hear otherwise, the 29th, where we usually meet with the planning commission, fifth Wednesday.
yeah, okay.
Okay. All right. Gentlemen, thank
I
you.
believe we have a meeting, a motion and a second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay. Have a great evening.